Hello students, we will now discuss about the Bretton Woods system and its key anchors, particularly the IMF, World Bank and the international agreement on trade and tariff which led to the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1995. We will proceed with the discussion of the Bretton Woods system in the following way. First we'll discuss about the background of the idea of Bretton Woods system, and then we will discuss what is exactly the Bretton Woods system all about, and then we will talk about the main anchors like the IMF, the World Bank. Now let us start with the background of the idea of Bretton Woods. Born after the period of devastation produced by two world wars and the Great Depression of 1929, a new economic order institutionalized under the Bretton Woods system attempted to remove trade barriers, promote prosperity, and thereby prevent a repeat of past tragedies. So basically the idea to promote international trade and commerce so that it can increase more and more prosperity to other communities and countries and prevent the past mistakes, past tragedies that were instrumental for a lot of authoritarian and anti-democratic tendencies in different parts of the world. The major factor behind the agreement was the desire not to return to the economic instability and chaos of the interwar period. We have already discussed how there was problem in the interwar period, how there was rising economic instability, how there was rising unemployment, and how these economic issues and vulnerabilities were used by the military dictators to justify their dictatorship, and how that caused the Second World War. Such concerns were made especially pressing by the recognition of the role that unemployment and economic insecurity had played in the rise of fascism and the circumstances that led to the Second World War, and these were the concerns that were capitalized by the undemocratic leaders for their vested interest, which ultimately resulted in their causing the Second World War. The chief lesson of the Great Depression of the 1930s were therefore the so-called beggar thy neighbor policies of protectionism, which were economically self-defeating and politically dangerous. So basically the idea was to go out of the Great Depression of early 1930s and to move or to overcome the earlier kind of protectionist policies that were considered something self-defeating and politically dangerous. However, such tendencies could only be countered if a framework of norms, rules and understandings could be established that enabled the states to cooperate over economic issues and avoid the pitfalls of the welfare dilemma. Basically the welfare dilemma is based on the assumption that if you are helping the people, or if the people are getting unearned income, how that could be harmful to other areas of economy. So basically the idea is whether you will, if somebody is rich and other is dying because of starvation, what should be the role of the state? So the main idea was to establish some important international institutions, framework of norms, rules and understanding that could help the states to cooperate with each other on economic issues and avoid the kind of tragedies, the kind of problems that they faced during the interwar period, and particularly what is called the welfare dilemma. So welfare dilemma is a kind of dilemma that most of the welfare countries face when they deal with their citizens, when they deal with economic disparity, because when you are giving some help to the people who are dying of starvation, who are suffering from hunger and starvation, either you are helping them or you are creating problem for their long-term economic survival or economic sustainability. So that is the problem, that when you are giving or supplying ration in a nominal charge, or maybe rice in rupees 2 only, that also makes the people not to work, not to engage themselves in any kind of earning. So the point is that's a kind of dilemma that the modern economists are concerned about. That's a dilemma all countries who claim themselves as welfare countries or welfare states, they are all worried about. Now let us discuss about the Bretton Woods system and how it was institutionalized to overcome the problems of the interwar period. In August 1944, USA, UK and 42 other countries, they met at the UN Monetary and Financial Conference at a very small resort town called Bretton Woods, and that was in the new hemisphere of United States, to formulate the institutional architecture for the post-war international financial and monetary system. So basically, the conference was held in between the Second World War in 1944, and the idea was to create an institutional infrastructure that would address the needs of the post-war international financial and monetary needs. Delegates from other countries like the former Soviet Union also attended, but given their long-standing antipathy towards capitalism, the Soviets did not accept the institutional arrangements agreed by the other participants. So basically, as we have already discussed, communism has a different kind of understanding about capitalism, and because of that reason, the Soviets, they were not agreed or they did not accept the institutional arrangement that were established or that was established in the Bretton Woods system. So the Soviet Union did not accept the institutional model established by the Bretton Woods system. The 1944 conference had two main goals. The first was to stabilize the value of money, and the second was to promote international trade and commerce. And to facilitate these ideas or these goals, three new bodies were established, and they were all called the Bretton Woods system. The three bodies were like this. The first was the International Monetary Fund, which came into operation in March 1947. The second was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, better known as the World Bank, which came into operation in June 1946. The third institution was the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, in short we call it as GATT, which was replaced by the World Trade Organization in 1995. Although the GATT is usually seen as a part of the Bretton Woods system, it was created by the UN Conference on Trade and Employment and came into operation in January 1948. So the point is, all these three institutions, either they are GATT, they are IMF or the World Bank, they were all created for promoting international trade, for facilitating international trade and commerce, so that the kind of devastation the countries face, particularly the economically advanced countries of Western Europe, so to help them to come out of the economic problems they faced during and after the Second World War. Now let us talk about the first main organization of the Bretton Woods system, that what we call the IMF. In the very beginning, the main task of the IMF was to create a stable international exchange rate system and to provide emergency assistance to states facing temporary balance of payment problems. So the main purpose of IMF was first it was to create an international exchange rate system that would be stable, and second to provide emergency assistance to those countries who were facing the problem of balance of payment crisis. In 1972, this system collapsed when the United States announced that it would no longer guarantee a system of fixed exchange rates. This decision of the USA was revised in 1976 when the International Monetary Fund formalized the system of floating exchange rates, a policy more consistent with economic liberalism. So the IMF accepted the floating rate of exchange since 1976, and this whole concept of floating exchange rate was consistent to the new economic policies or neoliberal policies of that period. From the early 1980s onwards, the IMF increasingly focused on supporting developing countries afflicted with debt crisis, and in due course the transition countries. So basically from the early 1980s onwards, the focus of IMF was the developing countries and those countries in the Eastern Europe and in other part of the world, those who transitioned from communist system of governance to the democratic system of governance. In its wider role, the IMF is responsible for managing financial crisis and helping to ensure that national and regional crises do not develop into global crisis. So basically, the purpose of IMF is to manage a situation of economic crisis that do not transform into a global crisis. So if it is a regional crisis, the crisis should be addressed at the regional level so that it doesn't become a global crisis. The IMF is a specialized agency of the United Nations, but it has its own charter, governing structure and finance. Its highest decision making body is called the Board of Governors, on which the voting right is basically given on the basis of the relative economic strength of the member states, not on the basis of sovereign political equality, on the basis of which the United Nations General Assembly operates. So here you get voting rights on the basis of your financial contribution. It has nothing to do with your sovereign political equality status or one country one vote. So that is the reason why the IMF is criticized, because it gives weightage to your economic contribution. And another issue that is relevant to the IMF is its MD, the managing director, is always an European. So no managing director can be from any other continent except Europe. So that is the logic. And when I say Europe, it is mainly the developed countries of Western Europe. So the point is this is how the IMF operates through its institutional mechanism. The IMF has, however, become an increasingly controversial institution from the 1980s onwards. This is because it linked the provision of loans to developing and transition countries to conditions such as structural adjustment program that reflected an unqualified faith in free market and free trade. So basically the IMF policies are guided by neoliberal ideas and free market, and basically it was criticized because of its focus, because of its emphasis on the structural adjustment program that would make these countries market friendly, where you will find the state has less involvement in financial sector. The supporters of the IMF argue that despite short-term instability and insecurities, an adjustment to an open and market-based economy is the only reliable road to long-term economic success. So those who support the IMF policies, or those who support IMF as a global institution, they think that structural adjustment program may be problematic for a short term, but over the long term or over the long period of time, it is always beneficial for the country which has initiated the program, which has adopted the program. As we can see that countries like China, countries like India, those who have been benefited by the structural adjustment program, because when India liberalized, its economy was in a very bad shape, but over the period of time it made tremendous progress in the economic affairs. So the point is those who support the IMF policies, IMF as an institution, their argument is that so it is beneficial, maybe not just beneficial in the short term, but for the long term it is of course beneficial for countries who undergo for structural adjustment program. Moreover, it often provides loans to countries that can find no other source of finance, and that its interest rate is generally competitive than those otherwise available. So those who support the IMF policies, so they argue that it is the only institution that gives loan to the poor countries, to the developing countries, to the countries in transition, because there are not other sources of funding, and if there are then their funding it's not very sustainable, or they charge interest rate that may be higher than the IMF. So that's why that is a benefit of the IMF. The IMF also provides extensive information services, not the least reviewing and making recommendations about the economic health and stability of the member countries. So IMF doesn't just give loans, or it addresses your structural adjustment programs or problems associated with the structural adjustment program. Rather, from time to time, it also gives extensive information about the state of your economy or the stability of their economy, particularly those who are the member countries of IMF. However, the IMF has been subject to very severe kind of criticisms. The skeptics particularly look at the IMF as an institution that serves the neoliberal agenda, or the neoliberal global agenda, forcing the poor and backward countries to vulnerable positions so that they can accept the US business model that benefits the USA and its big tech companies or its transnational corporations. So in that way the IMF basically tries to penetrate or make the backward countries and third world countries or maybe the developing countries or countries of global south to pursue policies that will in a long run benefit the USA and its western allies or their companies. The fact that IMF intervention has often caused more problems than it has solved, which stems from the fact that its development model is basically flawed and which fails to recognize the possibility of market failure or the drawbacks of an economic openness. So the IMF is not concerned about your economic failure. It is not concerned about your the market failure. Rather, what it is concerned is now you have to undergo for a structural adjustment program that in a long run will benefit the funders, particularly the USA and Western allies of the United States. The IMF has also been viewed as an enemy of democracy and human rights on the grounds that it has always provided or it has mostly provided a loan to those countries which are basically ruled by the military dictators, especially ones that were politically close to the United States or the Western interests. So if you look at the IMF policies for the last several decades, you will find most of the countries, those who have received the economic assistance from the IMF, they are all military dictators or sometimes they are very close to the USA because USA has a major say in the IMF. So definitely, if you are close to the USA, even if you are not a democratic country or you are ruled by the military dictators, so there was no problem in getting loans. So in that way, many criticize the IMF for anti-democracy policies, or maybe sometimes its policies are against the human rights of the people. In the wake of 2007 and 9 global financial crisis, the IMF was routinely criticized for not having prevented the crisis by highlighting the instabilities and imbalances that led to this kind of crisis. This led to the calls for the reform of the IMF, particularly to strengthen its ability to regulate the global financial system through necessary structural reforms. So because of the global financial crisis in 2007 and 9 that affected the countries of Europe, of the United States, and also to some extent the other countries except perhaps the Chinese, there was strong demand for structural reforms in the IMF so that it addresses the economic problems faced by many countries. So that shows the limitation of IMF, that it is basically serving the interest of the funders. It is basically serving the American interest or the interest of its Western allies. Now let us discuss about another important Bretton Woods system, that is what is called the World Bank. Originally called as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, it's popularly known as the World Bank, commenced its operation in 1946 with a membership of only 38 states, which has now gone up to more than 180 countries. It is headquartered in Washington DC and is one of the key agencies of the United Nations. So if you look at the specialized agencies of the UN, it is in that way considered as one of the specialized agencies of the UN, although there are many structural differences between the UN specialized agencies and the IMF and World Bank that we will discuss. While the IMF and for that matter GATT and WTO have been primarily concerned to establish a regulatory framework for international economic relations, the World Bank is basically doing a kind of redistributive function. This initially concentrated on assisting the post-war recovery in Europe, but from the 1960s onwards, it increasingly focused on the developing world and the transition countries. So basically the purpose of the World Bank was to help the countries of Europe, particularly the Western European countries, from the harmful effects of the Second World War. But over the years, particularly from 1960s, it focused its attention to the developing countries, and particularly to the countries that were transitioning from communist model of development to the capitalist model of development. It does this by providing low interest loans to support major investment projects as well as by providing technical assistance. However, how it has done this has changed significantly over a period of time. So most of the time, it has invested, or it has given loans for investing in major investment projects, major developmental projects, besides providing technical assistance. But how it has done, in other countries, that is again changing from time to time. During its early phase of the so-called modernization without worry, it mainly supported large infrastructure projects in areas such as energy, telecommunication and transport. So during the early phase of the World Bank, the focus was basically on modernization projects or projects that would cause modernization but without any worry, without any concern, and it basically funded the large infrastructure projects such as energy, telecommunication and transport. However, since early 1970s, its priorities shifted towards the projects dealing with basic needs and what were perceived as the underlying causes of poverty, which drove the bank into areas such as population control, education and human rights. So in the early 1970s, it was considered that if you want to remove poverty or address the issue of poverty, then you have to also focus on the overpopulation issue, or to control the population. You have to focus on their education and respect their human rights. So because of the changing notion of poverty, so over the period of time, particularly in 1970s or early 1970s, the focus of World Bank has been to address the issue of poverty, address the issue of basic needs. The day-to-day running of the bank is handled by an executive board consisting of 22 directors. Above the executive directors are the president and the board of governors. The board includes a representative from each of the member countries. So it operates basically through three institutional frameworks. First, you can call the executive board consisting of 22 directors. Above the executive directors are the president and the board of governors. The board includes one representative from each of the member countries. So first, you have the executive board, then thereafter, you have the board of governors, and the final is the president of the World Bank. Voting power is proportional to the economic contribution made by the member states like the IMF. But the United States, because it substantially contributes to the budget of the World Bank, it enjoys the largest number of votes. So voting share in the World Bank is proportional to the economic contribution made by each of the member countries. But if you look at the voting share of the United States, it has the largest number of votes because of its economic contribution to the budget of the World Bank. The president is appointed by the executive directors generally for a 5-year period and has always been an American, the largest shareholder in the bank. So if you look at the IMF, there is always a MD who is from Europe, particularly from the countries of Western Europe. And if you look at the World Bank, its president is always an American. Presently, it is headed by an Indian American. There are, however, many critics who criticize the World Bank for its functioning. At one extreme, you will find some critics who call it as a wolf in the sheep's clothing, particularly because the bank is primarily an institution for opening of the global south markets for the economically advanced countries rather than being devoted to reducing world poverty. So because the target of the World Bank is to open up the economies of the global south so that it serves the economic interest of America and other Western allies. So that's why many criticize it as a wolf in sheep's clothing, because it's not something doing for addressing the problem of global poverty. Rather, whatever it does, it does for the benefit of the Americans, the Europeans. Other writers have been critical of the bank's large project mentality, arguing that it has failed to consider local issues such as the environmental impact and the role of women in development. So if you look at the economic assistance of the World Bank, you will find that most of the time it has funded the so-called large developmental projects, ignoring the environmental impact, ignoring its impact on different sections of the society, particularly on the marginalized, such as the women, the children, and the elderly. If you look at some of the projects, they are not interested how that is going to cost the particular country environmentally, or whether it is sustainable in the long term or not. What they have done is to invest and to get the profit and go. So that is how the World Bank is highly criticized by some of the economists. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. We discussed that the IMF has faced increasing controversy since the 1980s due to several important reasons. These include the structural adjustment programs implemented as a condition for providing loans to countries in financial distress, like you can see in case of Sri Lanka and Pakistan. The conditions attached to its loans perceived as infringing on the sovereignty of the recipient countries. Its neoliberal economic principles of promoting free market ideologies and its handling of financial crises such as the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s and the global financial crisis in 2008. Overall, these factors have contributed to the perception of the IMF as an institution that imposes policies favoring the global financial interest at the expense of social equity and national sovereignty, leading to an ongoing debate about its role and effectiveness in the global economic governance system. Over the years, the World Bank's objectives has evolved from primarily focusing on post-war reconstruction and infrastructure development to encompassing broader goals such as poverty reduction and social development. The governance structure of the World Bank consists of board of governors representing the member countries, a board of executive directors responsible for day-to-day operations and decision making, and a president appointed to lead the institution and oversee its policies and activities. Some of the main criticisms against the World Bank include conditionality and structural adjustment programs, focus on economic growth over social welfare, environmental and social impacts, lack of accountability and transparency in its decision making processes, and promotion of neoliberal policies that only benefits the rich countries. In the next lecture, we will discuss about the World Trade Organization and how to reform the Bretton Woods system. Thank you very much for your attention. See you in the next class.